So first up for the afternoon session, we have a talk from Tonmoy Jitu on atomic stealers, Dyld injection tactics. So please take away Tonmoy and welcome to the stage.
Thank you everyone for showing up. So today's presentation is going to be on macOS dynamic load library injection attacks. And we're going to focus specifically on the atomic stealer malware. So starting off with who am I? I'm Tonmoy. I'm a threat researcher at Sophos, also a first-time speaker, and my interest lies in, thanks. And in terms of my interest, it lies in finding files which usually go undetected. So usually you have a detection of 0. So the malware has been seen in the wild for the very first time. Also interested in breaking down malware binaries and hunting for anomalies in logs. So in terms of today's agenda, we'll cover the current landscape. We'll also talk about the Dyld injection. We'll then move on to atomic stealer, the attack chain, the anti-analysis technique it uses. Then we'll move on to the capabilities and close it off with some detection strategies and the current exposure. So let's start off with why this matters. So if you look into the current macOS landscape, the macOS enterprise adoption is increasing almost every day. You also have new malware families emerging almost daily or weekly. And in terms of detections, back in 2023, we have seen a massive rise of over 60%. In terms of current vectors, these are usually deployed via social engineering of fake installers. You also have supply chain compromises and also have legitimate app abuse. In terms of some telemetry, so in the last 7 months, if you look into this slide, this is the overall malware being deployed in macOS infrastructure, the OS. And if you look into the blue bar stack, you can see that's the info stealer bar stack. And over the months from March to September, the bar has been rising on and on. So this is only the trend from the current year, but it's still going and increasing almost every day compared to other malware families. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about this specific AMO sample, which was first submitted to VirusTotal on 3rd of March, which is the day I started reversing the binary and working on it. Why this is important is because this specific sample uses anti-analysis techniques. It also has multi-architecture support, active safety infrastructure, and also bypasses the basic security measures. Now, one of the curious things that got to me is if you look into this chart, there is a dwell time between 3rd of March to 20th of March. So between 10 days, the sample was showing up as 0 detected. Now, there could be many reasons for this one. The first reason being when the sample was submitted and until 20th of March, someone or something didn't really press the reanalyze button, which is why you suddenly have a pop-up of 20 vendors detecting it. So if you're an analyst who, please do not rely on VT verdicts, but if you do rely on VT verdicts, please click the reanalyze button because you'll get the new engines that are detecting on this one. Another interesting factor, because when it was first submitted, it was run a static analysis, but engines also detected on behavioral analysis. One important thing with this sample was this one specific line of code. So if you go to VT right now and look into the behavioral analysis section, this line of code, what it does is it checks if the infrastructure of the virtual machine is either QEMU or VMware. So if it detects that if it's either QEMU or VMware, and once it's detected, it go like, okay, I'm running on a QEMU or VMware, I'm going to exit myself. So when you look into the behavioral analysis, you don't really understand or see what happened afterwards. So the malware stopped running and VirusTotal go like, okay, this binary doesn't really do anything. It's just a benign binary, which is why this was quite interesting. Now let's move on to dynamic load library injection itself to understand the technique better. So in terms of mechanisms, this particular injection method can be used in 3 different ways. It can be used using environment variables. It can be used using binary modification. It can also be used using runtime injection. For this specific talk and this sample, we're going to focus on environment variables because if I go on talking about all the other methods, I think I'll have to do a 3-hour presentation, which is not ideal because we all want to go home. So moving on to the environment variables, this is the official definition by Apple. which was super hard to find because I actually had to scrape it off the web archive because you don't really find this definition anymore and they've changed it. So starting with the definition, it has a lot of buzzwords and stuff like this is a colon-separated dynamic libraries to load before one specified, which when you read it, you're like, what is this talking about? Also uses fancy words like DYOLD, force flat namespace. So let's make it easier. What it typically does is it has an environment variable and it sets the DYLD inside library's value to a malicious pathway. For those of you who are not aware of what an environment variable is, it's pretty much in a host machine, it's like a shortcut that tells you where specific files are. So typically an injection command would look like this. You have the environment variable set to the malicious library pathway. Then you would run or pass a benign application, for example, calculator. And when calculator would launch, instead of running on validated libraries, it will go and find the malicious library. In terms of the process flow, so it starts off with the application launch. Then you have the load library being initialized. And once the library is loaded, the symbols are resolved and the process is executed. So if you're wondering, okay, libraries are being executed, what is Apple doing about this one? So Apple does have existing mitigations that it has been developing over years, and they're still working on it. So the first one is SIP, which is the System Integrity Protection. This pretty much blocks modification of any and all system paths, so it reduces hijack opportunities. Then you have Gatekeeper. You'll hear me talk about Gatekeeper a lot here, which is quite important. So what Gatekeeper does is it checks code signing on downloaded apps and blocks unsigned and untrusted applications. Then you also have hardened runtime, which enforces library validation, so make sure that only valid libraries are allowed to run. Then notarization is there, which blocks unauthorized code. And you also have entitlement restrictions, which limits risky entitlements. And in this case, the one we're going to focus on is the allow DYLD environment variable. So let's move on to Atomic Stealer. So looking into the Atomic Stealer memory, it targets all macOS OS. And in terms of architecture, it supports both Intel and ARM-based architecture. And the goal of this malware is pretty much to steal credentials and if it finds any crypto keys in the wallets. And the delivery method is usually via DMG installers. So the infection vector would pretty much look like either via phishing campaign or via malvertising. So you'll have little pop-ups on Google browsers with sponsor ads. And it usually would ask you to download fake software installers, which you would use almost every day. And it asks or prompts the user to open the application by using right-click, which performs execution. In terms of the architecture, as previously mentioned, for platform support, it supports both x86 and ARM64. So it doesn't matter whether you're running the old Intel or the new Silicon, it's going to work on both of them. In terms of binary characteristics, it has universal binary format. For code signing, it's usually none or invalid, so it uses fake code signing or runtime code signing, and it requires a gatekeeper bypass. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Gatekeeper, because you have almost heard me talk about using the word Gatekeeper a lot. So as per Apple's definition, it ensures only trusted software runs on Mac systems. It verifies that software which are not in the App Store are from an identified Apple developer. It also confirms Apple notarization and detects unauthorized software modification and requires user approval for first-time use, which is why Gatekeeper bypass is required in this case. Moving on to the actual malware or the malicious binary of what it looks like. It usually looks like this when you first open it. So it pretends or impersonates to be a benign application. For example, you can see on the first one, it's a Chrome application, and it actually gives the user instructions on how to set it up. So it tells the user, right-click on the icon and click open, which is one of the form of Gatekeeper bypass. And because it's a DMG file, they're compressed files. You can actually extract the DMG files and look into the underlying internal files inside it. So the first screenshot at the top is the folder structure. You have the macro files and all the meta library resource files. If you run a file on the macro file itself, you can also see that it supports both Intel and ARM64. And also, with all reverse engineering, I think the first thing we want to do is run strings on it, because why not? Let's get some IOCs out of the way. So when you run strings on it, you can see it's almost encrypted and you can hardly read anything that's actually readable code. For the core components, you have the DMG installer, which acts as a dropper. And if you are running it on your host machine, it would look like this. You will double click on the DMG file, which is the second screenshot. It also performs VM debugger detection to make sure any anti-analysis techniques are not there. Then it goes into data collection and communicates back to the C2. Okay, let's understand the process flow of how this is actually injecting the binary. So you have the stager app, which is the DMG file. So once it runs, it adds shellcodes to the macro binary. Then it runs two processes. The first process is the parent process, which is benign. And the second process is the child process, which actually calls the malicious library and executes and injects the Dyld library into it. So when I was reverse engineering the sample, this is what it looks like when you open it in Binary Ninja. So you have multiple functions that it's using, but one of the most interesting one that I found was the self-sign function, which is generating XML-based entitlement files. It also enables DYLD environment variables for injection. It disables page protection so that it can modify the memory space for injection. Also, it uses another function named mask process name, which kind of gets benign processes which are already running in your machine and pretends the child process to be named as that. I know the screenshot doesn't make sense because we're all not reverse engineers, but if we look into the XML-based entitlements, this is what it looks like. So this XML-based entitlement is actually being saved in the temporary folder, and you can see it's getting over permissive entitlements and self-assigning itself with those entitlements. And one of the most interesting one is the one in the middle, which is the allow DYLD environment variables, which is why it's saying that, okay, I'm going to allow any and all environment variables that I find in the system to run by this binary. So if you look into this stage a little bit more, here is where it does code signing, because you do need code signing to be there for any binary to be run on a macOS system. So it runs and grabs the entitlements from the temp directory where it saves it and signs the binary. Next up is masquerading the process itself. So the self-sign function would go ahead and call the mask process name and grabs one of these four hard-coded process names from the host environment, because these are all benign processes. You have networker, helper, security agent, and system events. So it will act like one of these processes and run it as a child process. Also uses OS script to run all this stuff. So moving on to the attack chain. So you have an initial infection, which is the DMG file itself, where the file system is loaded. So this is a high-level attack chain. And it does self-modification via process names. It also performs DYLD injection, which is the dynamic load library injection, creates persistence, then communicates back to the C2. In terms of what the operation would look like, it would take a screenshot. It would perform command execution, also does data exfiltration, and perform cleanup and stealth. So it goes through a constant loop of checking, okay, do I need to perform more persistence and capture more data? If not, at the end of the process, it would perform cleanup. If we look into the attack chain in more detail, so there are 7 phases of this attack chain. The first one is the initial compromise, where you have the malware delivery itself. And after the malware delivery, the file is written to the system or downloaded to the system. Then it goes into phase 2, which is self-modification, where it does code signing bypass. It adds itself entitlements, which is the permissive entitlements, sets itself as hidden. So you have the terminal, which is running in the background, which is hidden. And it also does kind of process following by disabling memory protection so that it can write itself in memory. For phase 3, it goes into process masquerading. So it finds a random process from one of the selection of 4 and launches it with a spoof name. After that, for phase 4, it does DYLD injection, where the DYLD environment variable is set up using the DYLD inside libraries. And for phase 5, it performs communication back to the C2. So you have C2 communication being established. It also uses a user agent And in terms of phase 6 for operational activities, it does screen capture every 5 minutes and transmit that data back to the C2. It also does command reception and execution to maintain persistence. Also performs process health check to make sure the process is running properly. Then for phase 7, which is the last one for cleanup, it does temporary file deletion, log tampering, and memory cleanup. Now let's look into the anti-analysis techniques. So when you're running, if you run this in a virtual machine, it will go and find the system information and grab physical memory to start off, make sure it's not a virtual machine. Then it also runs the same script which we have seen in the VirusTotal file analysis, which checks for if my virtual machine is either QEMU or VMware. I was indeed running in VMware, but you can use LLDB to debug this in runtime. And you can use breakpoints, and once it reaches the thread, which specifically checks for these virtual machine attributes, you can set the thread to be zeroed out so that you can bypass that and go and extract the memory out. If you want to know how I did this, I wrote a blog on this one, so that tells you more in details in terms of how I got the raw code out to understand the clear text code. So moving on to some stealth operations for this particular malware. So it sets itself as a hidden terminal. As you can see from the command, it sets itself to invisible. For file cleanup, at the end of the script, it performs the typical RMRF. So it removes any and all sorts of zip files it would create in the temp directory. And also for process name masquerading, like I mentioned before, it selects the 4 process names to make sure it's known as a spoof process. For a file-based data structure, it goes and finds any and all sorts of Chromium-based file structures that it can find. It also looks for text files, PDF files, docs files, because some users do have a tendency of saving their credentials in document files. I still don't know why it's a thing right now. Then moving on to, it also goes and looks for SQLite files, because macOS is heavily database formatted. So it grabs any and all sorts of database, SQLite database that it can find. In terms of cryptocurrency or crypto theft, it has hard-coded extension names. So these are all the extension names that it has hard-coded in the clear text code. It goes and finds, okay, if this wallet extension is there in the browser, grab all the wallet keys that you can find. Then in terms of system intelligence, it also collects hardware information, any installed application that the host would have. And on the other screenshot, you can see it also checks if the user password is valid. So it has functions that grabs the username and password and checks if the password is valid against the system itself. One interesting thing, it does have a collection limit, so it doesn't go in and harvest any and all things in the machine all in one go. It sets itself to a 10 megabyte limit, possibly because to bypass DLP or to make sure it doesn't get picked up easily. So it sets itself to a 10 megabyte limit, which is pretty small, so when it's transferring out data, and it doesn't get flagged. In terms of the C2 itself, so what it does is it uses curl and has a user ID, which is not base64, and also has a build ID. So the build ID is quite useful if you're a threat hunter to identify campaigns and variants. Also sets itself to a limit of 5 minutes, so it will run every 5 minutes. And as you can see, the file which was saved in temp directory named as out.zip, it sends that file out. Now, one question, if you are an Amos developer out there and you're listening to the talk, I was wondering if you could message me because it's 2025 and I do not know why you guys are using HTTP and not HTTPS. I mean, please use encryption. So moving on to detection strategies. So you have the typical detection strategies if you have access to the host machine itself. So you can use and look through the unified logs for network-based artifacts. You can look for any artifact that has com.apple.network or any one of the spoof names to find out, okay, what are those artifacts or logs look like. You can also monitor network-based activities if you're running a dynamic analysis to make sure if there is any established connections to any public IP addresses which are unknown. If you have the process ID, you can do a deeper dive using the process ID as well. For persistence, one of the main location is .ssh. You want to make sure that they haven't created any persistence via any SSH keys. Also check for launch daemons for auto starts. So you want to make sure those malicious DMGs or installers are not launching every time you turn on the machines. The last command is a one-liner to go and look through any and all launch agents. For file system monitoring, for looking specifically for DYLD environment variable, you can grep for DYLD inside libraries, but the first one, you will get a lot of false positives because a lot of benign applications use the DYLD insert libraries function. So it's pretty hard to grab out what's the malicious command and what is the good command. The other thing that helps is if you know the process ID, so you can link together logs in the log files and make sure that those are related to DYLD insert libraries. Also, if you have OpenSnoop installed, make sure, because in this case, we know that the file being written out is out.zip. So you can scan for, okay, what binary or what application is writing out a file named out.zip. And also, because it's an info stealer, it will definitely access your keychain. So you can look through the unified logs for, okay, what has accessed my keychain in the last 24 hours. You can reduce it down to 30 minutes, depending on when you think the process would have ran. In terms of process behavior analysis, you can use dtrust once you know the process ID. So these are good commands to keep in handy. Also enable macOS detailed to logging if you don't have it enabled, because this would be a bad time for any analyst out there, because you would have a hard time going through logs because there won't be enough. And to monitor for injection process specifically, you can use the logstream command, which logs all DYLD injection processes. Also, this will have a high amount of false positives, so you can use other commands to come and streamline which are actually the false positives to the true positives. Okay, so for indicators of compromise in terms of a behavior, if you think that you have been compromised by AMOS or this specific variant, check for DYLD inside libraries usage in your logs. Also check if there are any binaries in your temp directory or hidden folders. Check for C2 connections to random IP addresses which are not known in your environment. And one thing I found from a set of different variants out there, some variants actually have dedicated ports, so it would call out to, I still have no idea why they use ports like 999, 888. They're super easy ports to spot out, so do keep an eye out for that. Check for process name mimicking of Apple services names, and also any temporary entitlement plist that are being created in the temp directory, because these are heavily used for self-signing and allowing excessive permissions. So what does the current exposure look like? Dynamic load library infection is not something that it's new or it's discovered this year. This has been there for a long time, and it's still being misused. This doesn't target all Apple Store apps. It only targets non-hardened third-party apps. So if you have applications that you're downloading directly from the website, or if you have applications that are not hardened that you're downloading using Homebrew, those are affected because those are the applications that use weak imports and insecure permissions. Also, recent exploits which have been produced via CVE in 2025 is the DaVinci Resolve and the FastCAD Reader. These are actually video editors that are used by many people, legitimate applications. And you have Dyld hijack happening through these applications because when these applications were developed, it could access folders and it has over-permissive permissions. In terms of active tooling that are still working, you have SpectreOps, Mythic Poseidon C2 infrastructure, which also uses Dyld hijacking techniques. You also have other tools like Mac Injector Automated and Dyld Hijacking Toolkit, which are still active and are almost getting updated every week. So in terms of my personal opinion, should we be worried? In terms of attack infrastructure, with the newer macOS stuff, you don't have to worry about it because once you run the binary, Apple will give you millions of pop-ups saying that this is malicious, I'm going to quarantine it straight away. And almost all App Store apps are hardened itself. This only targets third-party and not hardened application. You also have SIP, which prevents system process hijacking, so which is running all the time. But the thing is, this doesn't run in kernel level. This runs it with host level privileges. So it asks you to give it privilege so that it can run. So it bypasses SIP as well. Also, like I mentioned, this is almost targeted towards third-party applications because they're not hardened or goes through the attack chain so much. And attackers usually exploit this for persistence and escalation because you don't really need admin rights. Also, in terms of this attack itself, it's not very stealthy. So even if it goes undetected, it leaves a lot of artifacts behind. And with the behavior analysis, it's pretty easy to spot out if something is infected or not. And also, it's viable for specific or low privilege attacks on vulnerable applications. So yes, in terms of my own research blog, that's the link to my own research. And you can always go to the Sophos research site where we publish about upcoming trends in different ransomwares or different malware variants we find. And also, that's my Twitter link. So yes, thank you.